After months of tense on-off negotiations, the US and Ukraine have finally signed a minerals deal. The White House pushed hard for access to critical rare earths as a way to pay for billions in future US military aid. So, handshakes in Washington, but is it a good deal for Kiev? Will it solidify US support for Ukraine against Russia? Or has Ukraine just signed away its resources for no hard security guarantees? Welcome to the day. Ukraine and the United States have agreed a deal granting the US access to Ukrainian mineral deposits. Washington says it's a signal of its commitment to Ukrainian sovereignty. The Trump administration has been pushing for this deal for some time, initially under terms that Kiev was said to have viewed as extortionate. Both sides are now hailing the revised agreement, which was signed in Washington on Wednesday.
After months of tense negotiations, Ukraine and the U.S. ink a minerals deal. Washington has long demanded compensation for the billions in aid it's given to Kiev. Now, the Trump administration has secured preferential access to Ukraine's mineral resources and an equal share with Ukraine's government in exploiting them. The U.S. says the deal is a message to Russia.
Today's agreement signals clearly to Russian leadership that the Trump administration is committed to a peace process centered on a free, sovereign, and prosperous Ukraine over the long term.
According to the Ukrainian Geological Survey, the country has large deposits of minerals. These include graphite and lithium used in batteries for electric vehicles, and titanium and zirconium used in aerospace. There are also deposits of rare earth metals. Ukraine says the deal is a win-win.
This is a strategic deal for the creation of an investment partnership fund. It's truly an equal and good international deal on joint investment in the development and restoration of Ukraine between the governments of the United States and Ukraine.
Ukraine managed to negotiate away several punishing terms from earlier drafts. The deal doesn't give U.S. businesses special privileges over European investors that could hamper Ukraine's EU membership bid, and it won't be asked to compensate the U.S. for its previous assistance. Harsher terms were on the table when Zelensky visited Trump in February. The meeting was a diplomatic disaster. President Volodymyr Zelensky wanted security guarantees from the U.S. That's still off the table, but Trump says the new deal will discourage hostilities.
It's also good for them because you'll have an American presence at the site, Chris, and the American presence will, I think, keep a lot of bad actors out of the country, or certainly out of the area where we're doing the digging.
Signing the deal may have been the easy part. Some of the resources lie in Russian-occupied territory. Ukraine says those reserves are worth 350 billion euros.
Well, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky also praised the deal, describing it as a truly equal agreement built on fair terms. He said the breakthrough came during his sit-down with Donald Trump ahead of Pope Francis's funeral last week.
We spoke with the President of the United States, Donald Trump, about our readiness to conclude an agreement. We spoke at a meeting at the Vatican. In fact, we now see the first outcome of that meeting, making it truly historic. We eagerly anticipate further results from our discussion. It was a meaningful and highly productive conversation, with every minute utilised by President Trump and I to its fullest. I extend my gratitude for this, and once again thank both the Ukrainian and American teams for their professional work. While negotiations were sometimes challenging, the final result is strong.
Let's look at this with John Herbst, who was US ambassador to Ukraine during the George W. Bush administration. He's now senior director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Centre. Welcome to DW. Do you find any element of the way this deal was arrived at troubling? Because to the outside world, it looks like America effectively said to Ukraine, do this deal or we walk away and let Russia flatten you.
If you were to base your analysis on the original text that Besson, Secretary of Treasury Besson, brought to Kiev in February or even a later version that I think was published in the Financial Times 5, 6, 7 weeks ago, I could understand that conclusion. If you read the text of the agreement now, I think you'd have to accept the judgment of Ukrainian Prime Minister Shmyhal that it's a deal which suits economically both Ukraine and the United States. And if you throw in the security element, no security guarantees, but the security element, it's a huge plus for Ukraine, but also a big gain for the United States.
Tell us more about this security element. As you say, there's no security guarantee. So what does Ukraine get out of this?
There are two elements here. The first is the point made by President Trump that if American industry, American business is on the ground in Ukraine, especially in areas near the line of demarcation between Russian troops in occupied Ukraine and Ukrainian troops in free Ukraine, that's a major disincentive for Moscow to move further, at least where Americans are located. That's point one. Point two has not been remarked by Trump, and it's perhaps the more important point. Since Trump won the election and since Trump took office in January, not once has he or anyone associated with him talked about new weapons coming under Trump to Ukraine. This deal has language in there to the effect that any new weapons coming to Ukraine would add to American equity in the joint project. That's big. And to kind of underscore that, there's news today about new weapons coming from Trump to Ukraine. I suspect the coincidence is not a coincidence.
Okay. How is this going to...
Moscow is deeply unhappy about this development.
How is this going to work, do you think, then, in practice? Because we have significant Ukrainian mineral deposits in Russian-occupied territory. Is President Trump just going to let President Putin have them?
Look, I don't expect that to occur. We don't know precisely the value of the critical minerals and rare earth minerals in Ukraine. I've seen estimates up to $26 trillion. I know that a lot of this is based upon old Soviet resource maps. I've seen the question is, how is it split up between Russian-occupied Ukraine and free Ukraine? And I've seen 40-60, 60-40, somewhere in that range. But even 40% of 26 trillion is a great deal of value in terms of critical and rare earths. So there's going to be plenty of minerals currently controlled by the Kiev government for this deal to work on. And I think it will be worked on.
Understood. And why do you think the Trump administration was so eager to make this deal, a deal that will take decades to capitalize on?
Well, I think it reflects strategic intelligence. It is a national scandal that we are beholden to Chinese-controlled supply chains for rare earths. As we know, China, A, has a lot of rare earths, and B, has been diligently building up its stock by making deals around the world. So we need to have rare earths and critical minerals supplied by our friends, our partners, and our allies. And Ukraine fits that description, and they are reasonably rich in critical minerals and to a lesser extent in rare earths. So this is just sound strategic sense. Biden was pursuing this too globally, but in a very, very slow pace. Trump moves much faster than Biden. On an issue like this is very much to the American advantage.
So you've said and written that this is a bad day for President Putin. What sort of day is it for Ukraine's European allies?
I think our European allies, Ukraine's European allies, understand, I think with greater clarity than the current administration here, how important it is for Western strategic interests, critical interests, that Putin not win his war in Ukraine, meaning that Putin not get effective political control of Ukraine. And this step, today's step, the critical minerals deal, is important for increasing American support to prevent an ultimate Putin victory in Ukraine.
Okay, so Europe should be feeling quite pleased about this deal, you believe?
About that.
Right. It's been months since the
There was
Trump...
also a bow. There was also a bow in the deal, a U.S. bow to legitimate EU interests in Ukraine. That's important too.
Okay. It's been months since the Trump-Zelensky bust-up at the White House. This was a deal that was not signed by the presidents. They sent their proxies. Are Ukraine and Zelensky and Trump, have they kissed and made up? Are they nicey-nicey again, or are things still a bit frosty?
I think there's a certain pall over the relationship, which is much less now than it was before the meeting in Rome. But I think it still exists. I believe that principally this is a result of the approach the administration has taken towards getting a peace deal, which has coddled the Kremlin and pushed the Ukrainians hard in ways that, to my mind, are not consistent with American interests. If Trump really wants to achieve a durable peace in Ukraine, which I think he does, he needs to put pressure on the bad guy, not just the guy who committed the initial aggression, but the guy who said no to every reasonable proposal Trump has put in play. So that's the principal reason.
Right.
The secondary reason is that Zelensky has been perhaps a bit too insistent in pointing out all these things to Trump. Zelensky has not been wrong substantively, but tactically he could have been shown more finesse.
Thanks for talking us through that, Ambassador. John Herbst is a former US ambassador to Ukraine. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Let's explore this deal with Gracelin Baskaran, who's director of the Project on Critical Mineral Security at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She joins us from Washington. Welcome to DW. President Zelensky has described this deal as truly fair. What do you think?
This deal is actually much better for Ukraine than previous iterations. As said, there's no repayment of former military aid provided. We still see that Ukraine maintains full ownership and authority of its natural resources. And the fund that will be managed by both as equal partners actually takes future mineral revenue. So current revenues are still exempt from this, future resource revenues, but it also opens a way for the U.S. to continue to provide military support. And that actually counts towards its contribution to the fund. So given there's no preferential access for U.S. takers, for example, they are able to access at market terms. But what we do see is that Ukraine is really getting a deal that puts them on a good long-term development trajectory.
OK, so the original deal, 90 pages. What was signed is just 11. So should we see that as the start of a process rather than the end of negotiations?
Absolutely. You know, one of the things that President Zelensky wanted was a security guarantee. We still don't see a security guarantee. However, there is a strong explicit alignment between U.S. and Ukraine on national and economic security. However, you know, for the mining industry, keeping in mind that a mine takes on average 18 years to develop and $500 million to $1 billion, peace will ultimately be important because investors have to feel confident in the longevity and the stability of that investment. So the peace deal would go a long way in helping this materialize, but is one of the things that's yet to be seen.
OK, so this is what we're waiting for. Nothing happens, even the negotiations happens, but no ground gets broken until the bombs stop falling.
No, so this still fully establishes the fund. So these are two separate things, right? So the fund, which sets up the structure for the fund and notes, you know, the future revenues, all of the ownership, that's actually already spelled out. So that's really important. When we talk about breaking ground, that's totally separate to both of these things, because this is ultimately not necessary. The future revenues coming from this mineral resources go into the fund. But ultimately, there's a lot of things that still have to happen. Number one, the mineral data that we use in Ukraine is 30 to 60 years old. It was actually done through a Soviet-era mapping. So we need updated mapping. The second thing we're going to see that probably as a result of this is start to mobilize infrastructure investment. Mining is extremely energy intensive, but we know that a significant share of substations have actually been damaged in the war. So there are other things that, you know, there are other elements here that will move. And this is a very, very strong signal. As you may know, the deal explicitly explicitly said that anyone who funded Russia will not benefit from this deal. So it takes a pretty strong position in terms of bilateral cooperation.
Would it be wrong to compare a deal like this, securing future US military assistance by granting access to mineral rights, with the sorts of deals that the Wagner Group were doing for Russia with some African countries, keeping governments in power in exchange for mineral rights?
No, I think this is quite different. So here's the, Ukraine is a democracy, and importantly, the revenues are co-managed by both countries. And we have to remember, Ukraine still has full ownership of their own resources. So I see it more as being a development partner, and I think alongside this, we'll see other countries in the European Union come in. Rebuilding Ukraine is not going to be done by a single country. It is absolutely going to be a multi-country consortium effort.
And do you see more of these deals happening, gaining commercially, governments gaining commercially from raw materials in exchange for aid from governments or countries that they're assisting?
Absolutely. The one that we're already seeing quite advanced is the U.S. with the Democratic Republic of Congo. Last Friday, we saw that Rwanda and the DRC signed a principles agreement to pursue a more peaceful outcome to the war currently going on with M23. We're expected to see a peace deal, they've said, by May 2nd, which is just around the corner. But this was part of President Tshisekedi's effort to get minerals in exchange for security minerals for security deal. And obviously the DRC has some of the best natural resources in the world, with significant reserves of copper, cobalt, lithium, nickel, et cetera.
So just going back to Ukraine, you've said that this is a long-term investment and a long-term business. Given the best of predictions, let's say there's peace in Ukraine next year, how long before minerals start actually coming out of the ground and money starts to be made?
We're in for the long run. So like I said, it takes about 18 years from the time, on average globally, from the time I identify a resource to the time that I have a fully producing asset. That's about 4.5 presidential administrations in the United States. Now, take into account that we still have to, one, do that geological mapping before we kind of turn that 18-year timer, but also that we need to build some of this infrastructure. So we're in for probably, a few decades now. A couple of resources could be different. So lithium, for example, some of these lithium reserves we were looking at moving to commercialization prior to the invasion. Something like that could come on quicker. But of course, 2 of the 4 lithium reserves in Ukraine are sitting on Russian-occupied land. So that the fact of where these minerals are and the way land has shifted over the last few years will also slow things down or potentially be an impediment to certain areas.
It's a fascinating analysis. Who knew rocks could be so interesting? Gracelin Baskaran from the Centre for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you so much.